Hi class, it's me again. So today we're going to be looking at, we're looking at the arguments for the existence of God. But I want to start by putting this in some historical framework of understanding for you. Because while we're going through this class topically, I also like to go through historically, because I think that provides some reasonable concept and construct for understanding the development of Western philosophy. So let's start there. So first of all, what we've been looking at so far is basically the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So we're moving now to looking a little bit further ahead, but just to put some of this in context, I created this timeline for you so you can get a sense of the scope of things. So you'll notice I have this reference to something called the Axis Age. And I talk about this more concretely in my world religion class, but you can get a sense of the fact that scholars talk about a particular time period from around 800 to 200 BCE, sometimes called the Axis Age. And what we see is that there were many interesting both philosophical and religious developments and concepts being talked about in this time period without there being conversations between different cultures. So, for example, we have been, for the last few weeks, looking at the philosophers of ancient Greece. And during this time period of the Axis Age, Greek philosophy is really in its heyday. We also know that the Jewish philosophers, the Jewish prophets were writing during this time period. And there was also there were developments in Hinduism in India, and there were developments in India with Mahavira, who was the founder of Jainism, and the Buddha, who's the founder of Buddhism. In China, we have the influence of Lao Tzu and Confucius. So this time period of the Axis Age was kind of an interesting period of time where new ideas were happening on the planet, but there wasn't necessarily any contact or conversation. So one of the things that I said last week about Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. And it wasn't until Alexander the Great, which toward the ends of the Axis Age in 300, that there was actual movement bringing Greek philosophy to other parts of the world. So just as a point of reference, I have included for you the most scholarly thought about when Jesus was born, around 4 BCE, and to 29 or 30 CE. And the other point of context is the destruction of the Roman temple in 70 CE. So I'm going to mention Plotinus in my lecture today because he was one of the Neoplatonists of the ancient world. So notice we're sort of skipping over a lot of what happens for about 600 years or so. And we're going to skip here to the medieval world. So another point of contact is that Christianity was illegal from basically the death of Jesus through the Edict of Milan, all right, where Constantine said people can practice Christianity again. It wasn't until like the end of the 4th century in about 390 where Christianity became the religion of the state. So we're going to talk today about Augustine. I'm going to mention briefly Hypatia, who's one of our only female philosophers and mathematicians from this ancient medieval world. So I want to bring her up. Then I'm not going to be talking about Islam today, but that's just a point of reference, right? And then we will be talking about Anselm and Aquinas from the 11th and 13th centuries. So just to give you a sense, there's a lot of period of time where we're going to be skipping over. There aren't really any significant, I shouldn't say there are no significant historical or philosophical events taking place, but very few, all right? Okay, so Plotinus. Plotinus was a Neoplatonist. So what is a Neoplatonist? He was somebody who was reviving the ideas of Plato some 500 years after Plato's death. So he accepted Plato's two-realm view of reality, and he identified one ultimate reality. So this is what Plato called the good, he called it the one, a God who is transcendent and impersonal, indefinable and indescribable, and apprehended by a mystical experience of unity. So compare that notion of the ultimate reality with what you may or may not know about the Judeo-Christian God. Okay, so at the time that Plotinus was writing, Christianity was still just conceived of as an underground cult. Judaism was well regarded in the ancient Roman world, but Christianity was thought of as a dangerous cult. So, but notice that this idea of a transcendent and impersonal God is actually very starkly different from the personal relationship of the Hebrew Scriptures and also the New Testament. Nevertheless, Augustine of Hippo, who was a bishop and a priest in Northern Africa, and what he did is he fused the Neoplatonic concept of the ultimate with the personal God of Christianity, of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So he kind of morphed Neoplatonism to fit Christianity. In a lot of ways, Augustine Christianized the works of Plato. The other interesting idea that Augustine of Hippo created was the notion that the world is not crafted from pre-existing materials, but according to Christianity, it was created out of nothing. So in reference to the first creation story in the book of Genesis in Genesis 1, Augustine argued that that suggested that God, who is the ultimate creator of the universe, was not working in time, but working outside of time. And that, in fact, when he created the world, he actually created time. But that God himself is out of time. A separate idea that Augustine brought about, which is not necessarily in relationship to his beliefs about God, but is an interesting idea. So, first of all, one of the philosophical worldviews that was very popular during the period from basically Plotinus through Augustine was skepticism was very popular. The idea that we could not actually know anything. So if we can't know anything, there's a lot of things we're not going to comment about, right? Well, Augustine thought about this, and he was at first persuaded by skepticism, but ultimately he said, no, skepticism we can refute skepticism because of the principle of non-contradiction. So essentially, the principle of non-contradiction was the idea that if you made the claim that something like a pen was straight, and you made that observation, you couldn't also say that the pen was not straight. That it was, so in fact, you could know something. You could know that a thing that you were describing couldn't be the description as well as the opposite, or what was contrary to the description. So in that sense, you could know something. Okay, so I know we're not reading about Hypatia of Alexandria, but I like to bring her up at the beginning of a philosophy course because she really was a very well-regarded mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who worked and taught at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. So she's really the first female philosopher. She was a Neoplatonist, so she believed in all those ideas that Plotinus believed in, but many people at the time, so she wasn't like Augustine and a Christian who was trying to take the Neoplatonist ideas and making them Christian. She was not Christian, and she ultimately, this is what got her into trouble, and she was stoned to death because she would not give up, like Socrates, she would not go back on her beliefs just to be accepted. You might be interested, or maybe you have seen the movie Agora, which starred Rachel Weisz. I recommend it highly. It's an interesting sort of exploration of history, and in this particular event of the death of Hypatia of Alexandria. Okay, now honestly, I think that the guy who does the Crash Course Philosophy does a probably better job of describing Anselm's argument. But just to reference that and reference the reading. So Anselm is having this conversation with Guanilo in your reading assignment, and he's saying there is some way that you can make a philosophical argument for the existence of God without referencing the Bible. Okay, and so he created what is referred to as the ontological argument for the existence of God. An ontological argument is an argument that references the ultimate nature of God. And Anselm basically said that we can imagine ideas because we can imagine ideas in our head, and also because ideas exist in reality. So he created this argument where essentially it's definitely a circular argument or a tautology, where he's saying because we have this, you could imagine a perfect being, and that idea exists in your mind, could exist in your mind. But he is saying it also exists in reality because you couldn't imagine and not imagine this actually being real. So his argument is a circular one. And essentially anything could be made up this way. A perfect island, according to Guanilo, or anything else, or more than one God could also be argued. So notice, I don't think these arguments are very persuasive, but I want you to know about them because they represent the historical movement of philosophy in the West. That there was a time when people were really trying to struggle with creating a logical argument for the existence of God rather than just relying on faith, because that is not a logical argument. St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican priest who was also a philosopher, and he disagreed with Anselm. He wasn't persuaded by Anselm's argument. He tried to move beyond it. One of the ideas that Aquinas asserted was that philosophy, which is based on reason, could support but not entirely explain theology, which was based on faith and revelation. He was essentially Christianizing the ideas of Aristotle. So he agreed with Aristotle's matter plus form metaphysics, and he also agreed with Aristotle's for cause theory, right? The formal cause, the efficient cause, the material cause, and the final cause. He agreed with those interpretations, and you'll see how he refers to them in his ideas for his proofs for the existence of God. But he did go beyond Aristotle. He said that the essence does not equal existence, and he asserted that souls are created directly by God. Remember, Aristotle had that three-part soul theory we talked about last week. But actually, Aristotle said souls are created directly by God. Now, for the last bit, we're going to just review briefly Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God. And he lays them out very systematically in the article in your reading assignment for this week. The first argument is an argument from motion. The second argument is the argument from the nature of efficient cause or causation. The third is the argument from possibility and necessity, or the argument from contingency. And the fourth is the argument from degrees. Now, these first four arguments are all essentially cosmological arguments, which is saying that due to the nature of, from speculation on the nature of creation, we can come up with some proofs for the existence of God. But they're essentially all very similar. The first one is saying there has to be, things are in motion. So things are in motion, and those things in motion are, their motion is initiated by a prime mover. Okay, that's the first argument. The second argument is things come to be, they're caused. Remember, the efficient cause in Aristotle's view is, the efficient cause is what makes the thing happen, what causes the thing to be. So not only is there a prime mover, there's a prime causer. There is, in fact, a contingency where something has, by necessity, something has to be first. And it's similar with the argument from gradation, which is basically there are organizing concepts which we adhere to. So there has to be a bigger organizing construct to reality. He's assuming there must be a higher being, because things couldn't just be randomly existing or floating around, because we need organization. So here he's really using some of Aristotle's methodology and applying it to Christianity and saying, here, I'm going to use some of these ideas to show you that there has to be this beginning point. Something must have started creation. Essentially, these arguments really do fall apart quite easily, because they don't necessarily refer to the Judeo-Christian God. They could refer to any god or gods even. But they also don't really hold up philosophically as evidence to support the existence of God. His final argument, which is called the teleological argument, or the argument from design, is something that's still used to this day, and some people find more persuasive, but there's still a lot of reason to say this argument falls apart as well. And the teleological argument, or the argument from design, is saying the design of nature implies a creator, just as a watch implies a watchmaker. So those are some of the ideas that St. Thomas Aquinas uses to support his proof for the existence of God. But most philosophers in subsequent years say these things really do fall apart.